we are. All set. Between the years of 536 and 540, there were a series of earthquakes in the land we now think of as El Salvador, and huge amounts of volcanic ash went up into the atmosphere and were then blown northeast across the Atlantic and then landed up over Scandinavia. Consequently, the skies over Scandinavia during those 4 years were darkened by the volcanic ash. And as a further consequence, that meant that the harvests failed for 4 years in a row. And about well over half the population of Scandinavia appears to have died of starvation in those 4 years. Now, the culture that emerged from that devastation is a culture that we think of as Viking, the Vikings. We think we know the Vikings, horns and all that, but we don't really know them very well. And the more you get to know them, the more alien they become, and nothing more so than in their view of religion. Now, like lots of primitive people, they believed in lots of gods, but the gods all had very strange birth stories. So, for example, one god emerged when the two legs of an existing god mated, and up came the third god, as it were. And then there was another one where a god licked a block of dirty ice, and a bit of dirt stuck to the god's tongue, and from that tongue emerged another god. So there's lots and lots of strange and peculiar stories like that of how the gods came into existence. And the gods were not nice on the whole. They were very, very cruel, not merciful at all. And the chief god, called Woden or Odin, was particularly nasty. Every crime you can think of, rape, pillage, murder, betrayal, whatever, he committed on a regular basis. And his particular speciality was bringing humans to life. But not so, the dead humans back to life, but not so they could live in bliss, but so they could live in eternal agony, having been brought back to a horrible existence. And he had a wife called Freya and a son called Thor, who was as evil as his father. And they've given their names to 3 of our days of the week. Wednesday is Woden's day, Thursday is Thor's day, and Friday is Freya's day. I'm not sure we should be celebrating them, but we do 3 times a week. And then another peculiarity of the Viking gods is that they worshipped each other. Of course, humans had to worship them, but then they worshipped each other. Well, in particular, the lesser gods worshipped the greater gods. So lesser gods had sacrifices to Woden and to Thor, and their favourite sacrificial offering were, of course, human children. So all very peculiar, but nothing more peculiar than their view of the afterlife. They believed in an afterlife, that they believed you would survive death, but they saw no connection between your behaviour now in this life and your fate in the next. So, for example, somebody might have lived a perfectly blameless life, kind to people, generous and so on, but he might end up, when his longboat capsized and he was taken to the bottom of the ocean, and there spent all eternity in cold, damp, dark bottom of the ocean. Conversely, you could have somebody who is incredibly evil, aspiring to be like Woden, very evil indeed, and yet he ends up warming his feet by the fire in Valhalla. So there was no connection between how you behaved in this life and your fate in the next life. Now that might make us think that the Vikings lived a life of moral chaos and anarchy. There was no kind of punishment for badness. Why bother to be good? But it wasn't like that at all. In fact, the Vikings had a very high degree of moral discipline. There was almost no adultery, no stealing, no false witness, no lying, and so on. They lived very moral lives. And in fact, that morality, that moral discipline, also translated into military discipline. So they were very tough militarily. And they were very successful, as we know. And they built up an empire that included, obviously, Scandinavia, but large parts of this country, large parts of Ireland, France, Spain, and Sicily. So they were very successful in military terms as well as in moral terms. The two went together. Now, how on earth did they maintain this moral and then military discipline if they had no belief in pain and punishment in the afterlife? Well, one way was very strict revenge rules. If, say, somebody in my family killed somebody in your family, you could kill 2 people in my family. So it wasn't just an eye for an eye, it was 2 eyes for an eye. And that was sanctioned by society. So the revenge was not only permitted, it was encouraged where some crime had been committed. So the fear of revenge kept people disciplined, well behaved. So that was one thing that was important, the fear of revenge. But the other thing that was important is this morality only applied within the Viking community. Beyond it, they were unbelievably cruel. So, for example, when in 793 they invaded Lindisfarne, where there was a great monastery on the Northumbrian coast, and when they invaded Lindisfarne, they beheaded and killed the monks in the most barbarous fashion, as some of the contemporary records show. And likewise, 5 years later, when they sailed across to Ireland and invaded Ireland, they were equally barbarous. The Vikings were so feared, in fact, that people often surrendered without a fight because they preferred just to be killed than to die a barbarous death in the battlefield. So, as I say, the moral discipline was just within the Viking people. But then a strange thing happened. Having created this great empire, they settled down and stopped conquering more lands and instead began to trade. And they became great traders. In fact, Ireland, the 5 cities of Ireland, are all Viking settlements, coastal Viking settlements for trade. So Dublin, Belfast, Galway, Cork and Waterford, the 5 main cities of Ireland, are all Viking trading cities originally. And Cambridge was another great Viking trading centre. The River Cam was a great Viking artery. So they became great traders, and that meant that they had to trust the people that they were trading with who weren't Vikings. So that meant their morality began to extend beyond their own people outwards. You can't trade overseas if you won't trust the people to pay you at the other end. So that was one thing. But then, and this is where my sermon is getting to, something much more strange happened than any of that. The Vikings had invaded countries that were predominantly Christian. So when they came to North Britain, North England, we were already mainly a Christian country. And likewise across the rest of Europe where they had their empire. Now at first, when they encountered Christianity, they thought how stupid this is. This idea of forgiving people, of loving your enemies, quite against their system of revenge. They're quite the opposite of the Viking system. So they thought the Christians were just naive fools. But gradually, this attitude began to weaken. And then, and this is the most extraordinary thing, in a very short space of time, around the year 900, almost all the Vikings, throughout their lands, converted to Christianity. Boy, ping, just happened. Now, some months ago, I went to a lecture by a distinguished historian in Cambridge on the Vikings. And he mentioned this conversion of Vikings that happened quite suddenly, but then just carried on speaking. He didn't concentrate on that at all. It seemed to be a rather insignificant event. But at the end, in the question and answer section, I asked him, what explanation is there for the Vikings making this conversion so suddenly? And he said, and this is a very odd thing for an academic to say, we don't know. No historian can explain this extraordinary conversion of the Viking people, as I say, across many lands, within a window of about 30 or 40 years. But if historians don't have an explanation, we do. What happened was an epiphany, a manifestation, a revelation, that suddenly God became plain to the Viking people. Now, I think what that means, when the wise men came to Jesus, at the birth of Jesus, they didn't know what to expect. They were astrologers. They were following the star. They believed that the stars held everything. But when they arrived and they saw this child in the manger, ping! They had a revelation, an epiphany, a manifestation. They didn't know what to expect, but suddenly they could see that this child was the child born to save the world. They had a ping moment, and their whole attitude changed. And that's exactly what happened to the Vikings. They had a collective ping moment. Ping! and they became Christian, a manifestation. A religion that they had first of all seen as foolish suddenly made sense. There wasn't a rational explanation for this. They hadn't worked it out on paper. That maybe it just does work. Suddenly, Christianity made sense to them, and they became followers of Christ. I think that is a most extraordinary story and a wonderful story. A ping moment. Now, to be a Christian nowadays in Britain is tough. We're on the whole regarded as stupid. These ideas of forgiveness and loving enemies and so on don't make a lot of sense to people generally. We're rather foolish, naive, we believe lots of things that don't seem to stack up according to secular ways of thinking. But we've all had ping moments when the gospel that seemed so odd and so peculiar suddenly made sense. Not made sense in the rational way of, as I say, working it out philosophically. It suddenly made sense in our minds and in our hearts. That's why we're here this morning. As I say, being a Christian is not easy in the West today, but we shouldn't get demoralised. We have the promise, I believe, in Scripture, that one day our people and all people will have ping moments, when it will become clear again to our compatriots that actually Christ is the Lord. What seemed to make no sense will suddenly make perfect sense. So we mustn't become demoralised. It's not we that are going to cause this change, it's God going to cause it within people's hearts, as he called it, within the Viking hearts. There will be a ping moment, a few short years in this country, when we'll go from being a secular country to once again being a Christian country. So what we must do is be patient and pray. Pray for a national ping moment.